morning, everyone. Welcome to the Water Policy Panel. A couple of housekeeping items before we get into what will be a vibrant discussion on what is becoming one of the defining issues of this legislative session and really the future of Texas. First, this is a CLE accredited course, so for any folks looking for that credit, I believe Aaliyah Formont in the back, she's holding up the clipboard. Please do sign in and get your information taken down. We'll get you the appropriate credit on that. So the way this is going to work, you guys are probably no stranger to this now. We're going to have a lively moderated discussion for the first segment and then spend the last 20 minutes or so with audience Q&A. So be thinking of your questions and we'll try and call on as many of you as we can. So I'm going to exercise moderator's privilege for a moment here as we intro this panel. For folks who have been longtime attendees of TPS, policy orientation, or any TBPF events, probably noticed this is the first standalone water policy panel we've had, and that is no mistake. It is by design, and I'm excited to announce, and we have publicly, but to you all, that we now have a standalone dedicated initiative on water policy, and already we're working with folks who are here on the stage today to make sure we're addressing what is already a crisis, but metastasizing further if we don't provide these solutions. And so for any folks in the audience that are interested in this issue, know that TBPF, we stand ready to assist as a partner with research and advocacy, and everything we do on all of our other issues, we now do on water. So to explain the why behind this, and then the panelists will really get into the weeds on what this discussion is all about and what it means for all us Texans here. My boss, Greg Sindelar, he tells me I have two responsibilities in my role as campaign director of water. The first is to make Texas and America the freest places on earth, and the second is to keep Texas Texan. And we'll hear a lot about statistics from various speakers about the economic gigantism of Texas, growth in business, growth in AI and data centers, and so many important metrics. But none of that provides the freedom, the prosperity, and opportunity for Texas can happen without water. And with those businesses moving here, with Californians moving here, of course, they're not bringing water with them. And so to keep this miracle that is not a miracle, it's by design. God may have blessed Texas on the 8th day of creation, but policy along the way is what has continued to set us up for success. And water is perhaps one of the single most important issues to safeguard that. And the final thing I'd say, in keeping Texas Texan, our CEO spent a lot of time in the interim crisscrossing rural Texas, and I believe he stopped in Lubbock maybe one or two times, and hearing firsthand from farmers and ranchers that oftentimes policymakers, the big ticket items don't always address where they need help the most. And when we think about what truly is Texan, perhaps nothing better personifies that than our farmers, our ranchers, and our ag sector. And so my way of bringing it back to say we're excited to be laser focused on this, but perhaps more importantly, the fact that we have the leadership this session to get this done, I think you're going to leave this discussion both concerned for the current state of water, but optimistic for what's to come this session. So with that, I will introduce our panelists. First, and to my immediate left, we have Senator Charles Perry. I could state kind of flippantly, you are the water policy guy in the legislature, and you have been for quite some time, sir. But specifically, he currently chairs the Senate Committee on Water, Ag, and Rural Affairs, and co-chairs the State Water Implementation Fund for Texas Advisory Committee and the Texas Infrastructure Resiliency Fund. Governor Abbott has appointed him to the Southwestern States Water Commission and the Western States Water Council. And Senator Perry grew up in the district he represents, graduating from Sweetwater High School and earning his Bachelor of Business Administration in Accounting and Management Information Systems from Texas Tech University. Senator Perry is married to his wife Jacqueline, and they have 2 children and 5 grandchildren. Then immediately to the senator's left, we have Jeremy Mazur of Texas 2036, and he serves as the Director of Infrastructure and Natural Resources Policy. Before joining Texas 2036 in 2021, he worked on energy and water policy in the Texas House and the Texas Senate. In fact, I heard an interview with you recently, and you've worked for numerous movers and shakers in the water policy arena. And so not just the House and Senate side, but also Government Relations Director for the Texas Water Development Board and the Railroad Commission. Importantly, Jeremy is an Eagle Scout, for all the Eagle Scouts in the room we have here, and graduated from Claremont McKenna College and received a Master's of Public Affairs from the LBJ School at the University of Texas. And last but certainly not least, we have my colleague, my friend Larry French. He serves as our Senior Fellow for Water Policy at the Foundation, and he's also the manager of Resource Analysis Group, LLC, a water resources consulting firm. From 2011 to 2022, French was a director of the Groundwater Division at the Texas Water Development Board, and he also served as the designated vice chairman of the Texas Groundwater Protection Committee. Prior to the board, French worked for groundwater consulting firms in Texas as well as throughout the US and Europe, and he received his bachelor's from UC Riverside and also his master's at UT Austin. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists. All right, so the first question, I actually want to start kind of hearkening back to yesterday. We had recently confirmed Secretary Brooke Rollins talking about her role in the White House. And for folks who tuned in, you know Rollins is an Aggie. She's a Texan through and through, and she made very clear that one of the areas that we can focus on growth is making sure we're getting agriculture policy right at the federal level, but then also things that we can do at the state level. So just opening it up, I'm sure if Greg Sindelar can relay the message to Brooke and President Trump, if we could fix one thing at the federal level as it relates to water policy, you get your magic wand, is there anywhere you guys would start or encourage Brooke Rollins and others to engage?
Well, first of all, I think she's a great pick. Some of my agricultural guys out in West Texas, who's this woman doing ag? And I said, we're in great hands. She's sharp, she's smart, she's engaged. Pretty much water has been local and state. I mean, there's not a whole lot of federal interaction on water policy. I will tell you that the thing that plagues this state and multiple other states is supply depletion, limited supply. So this sounds a little bit braggadocious, and it's not meant to be. The truth of the matter is this country and this state is wealthy enough to address the water issues we face, specifically Midwest to Pacific. And the grid that I have kind of put forth with the Bureau of Reclamation just in a 10,000-foot conversation one day is actually more simplified than the grid in Texas that I'm proposing. So this state, this country, and every community needs to wake up and realize the canaries are singing, some are dying, that we have a water supply issue. The good news is we have supplies to develop, very well done technology that has proved it can be economically done, and we have the wealth to do it. It's just a commitment or priority of the money. So I would suggest to Brooke that, first of all, you've got trade policy deficits that need to be addressed, and we need to quit funding our counterparts in third world countries that are now competing with our monies, because I'll use an example. You've got cottonseed that we pay $200 a bag or $100 a bag, whatever it is, because of all the technologies of Roundup Readies and other things built into it, and that same bag of cotton is being sold for $15 a bag. So there's a whole diverse things that she can address and tackle. But if I had to name one thing that's nationwide, not only agriculture specific, Midwest to Pacific, we have the same problem with droughts and lack of water supply. California, largest agricultural state in the world in some aspects. Arizona, those. We need to, I've coined the term, I hope Trump becomes the Eisenhower of water.
That's right.
We need that coordination, and that will address agriculture on a whole new plane when you reopen markets that once were closed because of lack of water. So I think she can get there. I haven't had the conversation with her. I've got a call into her guy and said as soon as she settles in a little bit, we'll visit. I'm looking forward to that. But agricultural markets are the number one reason. The unpredictability of a farm bill that guarantees downside protection when things occur, and it's weather related every season. But if you wanted to pick a major topic for the country as a whole, including agriculture, develop water supply.
Yeah. Great.
David, I would say embracing federalism is what's going to work best for Texas. And what I mean by that is Texas has been a very successful leader in the United States with an energy expansion. We're an all of the above energy portfolio that includes oil and gas and other generation sources, has really propelled Texas to being not only the nation's, but the world's leader in energy generation. This is an incredible asset that we should be very proud of. But a lot of this is driven by state policy, which is very free market, as well as a robust industry in this state. I think the same is also true when we look at water. I think Texas, we have our own water plans. We have our own understanding of our own water resources, be they groundwater or surface water. And if the question is like, what could the federal government do for Texas? My answer is honestly to like, let the state continue with its own forward-thinking policies with regard to water supply development and managing our own drinking water and wastewater systems.
Yeah.
And David, I would add to that very much from the Water Development Board's perspective. They have some very excellent financial support programs that benefit small and rural communities, but they're struggling for lack of funding. In fact, they're undersubscribed by several $1 billion. A lot of that, they depend on federal dollars, so that's not a policy so much, but certainly an area where there could be federal assistance that would help out many Texans.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for that, and we'll be sure to get, hopefully we can coordinate directly with the White House on many of these issues. Senator Perry, I'd like to start kind of high level with you. I joked, you're the water guy in the legislature, and your background from Texas Tech doesn't say you studied land management or husbandry and so on. So how did you find your passion for this issue? Where did that stem from? And take that however you want.
Necessity. We need air, and it don't take very long when you don't have air to figure out you needed it. Water's about a 4 or 5 day event, but in my region specifically, having been CPA for 40 plus years, farmers coming in every year, and all they can tell me is I had to drop my well another 25 feet. And you're already economically not making that work, so the cost of dropping that well is killing the production. So from that perspective, but actually in 15 with the freshman chair's position I received, I took this water plan and I started looking at it. And it's great to have a plan, and I want a plan. And we should keep this plan. People think I've kind of pulled out of the plan. Actually, the plan speaks to what I'm proposing, only it's real because we're putting funding to it. But if you look at our current plan honestly, with a lens of is it going to happen, I'll give you a good example. There are 21 reservoirs left in the plan to do. 4 of those in the plan were supposed to deliver water to Texans in 2020. They have not started federal or state or eminent domain. Those are typically 30-plus year projects. To back it up, the plan says 2070 is when all this stuff has to be in place. In reality, we're 20, 25 years behind on supply development to start with. So 250 is the real number in my book. Also, the plan, according to the plan, says we're 7 million acre feet short. It's a known commodity that we're going to be short on the plan. And when you back out things that can't happen or won't happen, and you add things that weren't considered, it's really closer to 10 to 12 million acre feet shortfall. So my passion, I guess, is to make sure that we're looking at water honestly and not have this false perception that we've got this plan, and then address how we fix it. The big conversation of the legislation that has been proposed is it's changed the perception from it's a local-only funded and development. I use the example, no mayor in this state can tell its constituents, I need $30 more a month for 30 years, and on the 31st year, you'll be able to drink from it. That's a political no-go. It's created a patchwork of depleting resource allocations, reverse engineering on not what was available or what was needed, but what the taxpayer would afford to do, and it's not connected. And so that's the first. We've successfully transferred that to a statewide infrastructure conversation, just like we do roads. If you want to know what my plan does, think state highways. It's that conversation. And then secondly, and more importantly than the first, for it to be successful, we have to dedicate a consistent stream of revenue, constitutionally dedicate a consistent stream of revenue, so that with predictability, vendors will come to the market for these decade loans and multi-billion-dollar projects. So that's the big policy shift in that. How are we going to get there, that 10 to 12? We got marine desal, we got brackish desal, we got produced water in the oil and gas desal, we've got surface water unpermitted inside the states, and we have conversation with outside the states that says we will sell you water too in legitimate political reality today. The plan itself today with competence can deliver about 6 million of the 12 million acre shortfall. It will get there. It's got some good things in it that are not what I'd call scarcity. I'm adding 6 million acre feet so that we'll get to that 10 to 12 million acre feet. And my window is we need to have a large majority of this working by 50. There's cities in this state that needed water yesterday. I had a water survey done of the rural water wholesale suppliers. 52% and said in 20 years or less they would be out of water. A large percentage of those are under 10 years. And 81% of the survey said we won't have water sometime in the future. That's a pretty scary reality when you consider everything in water is 20-year plus to bring online. And that's where, one other recent note, and it's something that I think most people know, there were options inside the plan that communities thought they would have, and I'm not talking about specifically reservoirs, but it's come up in the last week where a particular regional authority was thinking about, we had this as an option, doors been shut, and they went to a different path for a different conversation, and environmentally, that's gonna get shut down. And that's why we need to bring in new supplies that are more inputs. They're also spoke to in the plan. It's the second level of water. We've developed all the cheap water. All the cheap water in Texas has been committed or developed, or will be shortly. This is the next level of the plan that needs to be funded. Without that funding, without that constitutionally dedicated stream of revenue in November, none of this is going to happen.
So I have two things to add some other context to what the chairman just said. Two things to think about. We need to, the chairman talked at length about essentially how we need to expand our water supply portfolio. And there are two things I want to share with you about why I think what he's talking about is so important. First, this thing called the Texas economic miracle, which involves substantive and rapid economic growth and population growth. We're seeing prosperity across the state of Texas as more industries are locating here, they're expanding. This legislature and the leadership of our statewide elected officers, they have created the political and economic and regulatory conditions that have created this Texas economic miracle. It needs water in order to continue. And so if we want to have continued economic growth and prosperity, we need to have reliable, consistent water supplies. The second point I want to leave with you is, and this is a point that we make in our report, Texas 2036, if we don't expand our water supply portfolio and we're hit by another long, severe drought and we have scarcity, that's going to invite more government control of your water resources. The less of a public resource that there is, the more we can see government regulations and mandates with regard to how you use that. Now, sometimes you got to do that when you got scarce goods, but if we invest in expanding our water supply portfolio and expand the amount of water available to communities and regions across the state, we can avoid this issue of having more government control of our water resources. So when we talk about water this session, it is an economic opportunity for us. If we want to have this Texas economic miracle continue and enjoy the fruits of prosperity for generations to come, we need to have reliable water infrastructure. If we want to avoid government telling us what to do with our water resources, we also need to invest in expanding that portfolio.
Mm-hmm. No, well said, and I would mention that Governor Abbott agrees, right? For folks who tuned into the State of the State, he had 7 emergency items, one of which was water. And here's what we know, and I know Senator Perry is going to tell us even more that we're going to find out, is it is one of the top priorities the legislature will take on this session. And he called out Senator Perry and Chairman Cody Harris by name to lead on this. And also, we need to make a Texas-sized investment, an historic investment. That's what his call was, and I know that's what we're all working on here. And you mentioned, Senator, looking at the data honestly is key to getting many of these questions right. And so I'll open this question up. I don't know, Jeremy, Larry, and the Senator, whoever wants to take it. We know the state of the state based on what Abbott said. What is the state of water? What is the data telling us? What's your elevator pitch to folks who may say, well, it's the faucets, when I turn them on, water comes out, it's not really an issue. So what does the data honestly tell us?
So I break it down into 2 principal challenges that the state faces. First, when we look at the data in the state water plan that the chairman mentioned, Texas faces a long-term water supply deficit where our water demands are going up because of population growth and economic growth. Meanwhile, our available water supplies that'll be available during drought are projected to go down. And so this is going to leave like a long-term water supply deficit. Now, politically, where I come from, I just don't like deficits. And so that's why we have this water plan that identifies water supply projects, management strategies that can close that deficit to make sure that we have enough water for future generations. That's the first challenge that we face. The second problem that we're facing has to do with the problem of aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems. How many of you have had to endure a boil water notice over the past 3 years? Put your hands up. Okay, at least half the room has had to go through a boil water notice. That's oftentimes a symptom of having an aging, deteriorating drinking water system. We also have significant amounts of water loss. Our systems are so neglected, they leak enough water to fill a major reservoir every year, like Possum Kingdom or Lake Buchanan. And then we also have things like system of failures. What we argue in our report at Texas 2036, these aging, deteriorating systems cause like a series of small economic cuts in communities across the state that over time really amounts to a meaningful economic wound to the tune of like $320 billion over the next 50 years. So we can have about a state budget's worth of economic losses just due to the fact of our aging, deteriorating systems. Those are the two key issues we're looking at.
Yeah, and I just add on, Jeremy, you mentioned that deficit happening, and it's important to look and see why is there a deficit and what's going on there. One of the big drivers for that is the managed depletion of the aquifer in the High Plains, the Ogallala aquifer. So that's a big part of that deficit. The other part is in Houston, where they are weaning themselves off of groundwater, so they're reducing the supply there, mostly due to the threat of land subsidence. So it's important to kind of see where those deficits are happening, and it kind of keys your point, Senator, about the need to really address the agricultural water supply issues, because that's really such a fundamental economic driver for the state and really the nation.
Yeah, and I think it's security. I think it's cultural. What does a Texas look like without a cattle raiser? You know, there's just something in our DNA about that. We need to protect that. The valley's probably as bad a shape as any sector of the Texas. I've got hill countries with depleting wells and things, but in that there was 40 citrus varieties like 10 years ago. And we've had some citrus screening and things, but when you had a drought that exacerbated it, we're down to 10 varieties, I was told. We lost our sugar mill down there. You know, it shouldn't be that way. We don't have to have it that way. I'll speak to the leaky infrastructure. Let me clarify. When someone in the legislature says water and you put $1 to water, everybody thinks all water is covered. It's just the lack of understanding of what water means. We have flood infrastructure. We came out of Harvey with a flood bill, and now we have done most of the engineering cost out of the last 7 years, and it's primed at the pump, ready to actually implement shovel-ready conversations, but it has no funding. It's been subject to as the legislature can. We have leaky infrastructure, losing close to 140 billion gallons a year, I believe is the estimate. That's about 450,000 acre feet. That's a lot of water. So that has reached a critical mass. We know we need to fund the flood plan now that we've spent all that time and energy to do it. So that's, quote, another large ticket item. And then when you do the honest assessment of water supply, that's at critical mass. So how do you prioritize which one? Well, all under the current water plan proposal would get a continual dedicated stream of revenue for the first time in the history of Texas. So I prioritized it. I think supply is the biggest economic engine conversation we've got to address, so 80% of that would go there. 10% would go to SWIFT, which is maxed out on bonding capacity. We can no more leverage the SWIFT funds that we have in the past because the underwriters are saying, you're there, it needs more capital. It's performed admirably. And then Water Development Board, as Mr. French said, has all these great programs that are oversubscribed by 10 times plus that have not gotten funding and don't have funding consistently. It helps address the leaky infrastructure. I will say one caveat, it would be a great study for TPPF. There are communities that have collected fees to address plant and sewer and infrastructure, that those went to general fund to pay streetlights and officers. So as we have this conversation, there's going to be a reckoning, if you will, of water loss as well as fee diversion. I've been told it's as high as $3 to $4 billion across the state. Wow. So I don't know what the number is. The studies aren't there, but an estimate, a fair estimate. So it's time to have a come clean, and we all work together and partner to get back to where we need to be. But leaky infrastructure is partly because the cost and the taxing jurisdictions can't afford it over time. And everybody in public office makes budget priorities. But we got to stop diverting, and then we can partner up and fix these issues. Continual revenue stream is the only way to address large infrastructure projects. And the state has the wealth to start that. We will recover the cost of that infrastructure the state front loads once water delivery occurs. Under the cash flow model that I've done, high level, lots of experts looked at it. I think in about 20 years, we're on a self-funding mechanism. And it will then be able to flip around the percentages that if we're ahead in supply or better in supply we thought we'd be, we move it to infrastructure, or we move it to 10-year review is where the legislature steps in and look at those percentages to see how we're doing.
But it needs to be a constitutional dedication.
Constitutional dedication. I don't want to get in the finance weeds. There's two ways to dedicate revenue in Texas budget. One is constitutional. It's gospel. When you constitutionally dedicate money, the legislature comes into the session knowing that dedication is hands off. It can't be overcome by a budget priority of somebody else's needs. It is fixed. That's why our roads and bridges work. $38 billion are in our state highway fund this session because of a 2013 dedicated constitutional revenue stream. The other way is called statutory dedication. What that means is we dedicate it, we put it in a bucket and say it is dedicated, but we're not required to spend it. Now, being in that building 15 years, you never know what the budget priority is. I don't want water to be caught up in that conversation.
And there's some great evidence that constitutional dedication works to make infrastructure better. This week, the American Society of Civil Engineers released their report card on Texas infrastructure. Our roads improved from a grade of a D+ to a C-. Now, I'm sure if you have kids in school and they got a C-, you wouldn't be happy about it. Okay. But the fact that it got better is good. We want to see progress with infrastructure. And so the engineers are telling us that they're seeing evidence of Texas roads and highways getting better for our regions and our communities. And a lot of reason why this is happening is because of the constitutional dedication. It's also worth pointing out that the engineers noted that our drinking water and wastewater systems, well, those went worse. Our wastewater grades went from a D to almost failing D-. Our drinking water infrastructure went from a C-, again, not the greatest grade I'd bring home to mom, to D+, which would get me definitely in trouble going to school in the 1980s. So, yeah.
No, and I appreciate bringing up those new gradings because, again, this harkens back to the point of, if we have the systems decades and decades and decades ago that were already in shoddy, positions as we're growing, that's only going to continue to decrease. And you mentioned, Senator, the goal, the vision, if Trump can be the Eisenhower of water. I think it's fascinating the delineation between roads and water. And in conservative spheres, since we're a think tank, we have to ask a philosophical question here. There are still folks who aren't fully bought into the notion of the role of government in financing these perpetual water funds. And so I want to throw us up as a straw man. Maybe we start with Larry and work our way back. What would you say to folks who say, well, the state shouldn't get involved in this and leave it up to the private sector? We'll start with you, Larry. Love your thoughts on that.
Well, I imagine many of you have looked at the TPPF website. And when you see that, there are three words that come to mind: freedom, opportunity, and prosperity. How many of you think that you can achieve those kinds of principles with scarce water? It just doesn't work. We need water to envision that kind of future, that kind of present and future for our state. About 10 years ago, I escaped the bureaucracy of the Water Development Board, which is a great place to work, don't get me wrong. But I spent some time in a third world country drilling a water well. And that will give you a perspective on what water scarcity means to a society. Because basically the people in this location, they spent their whole day thinking about how are they going to get their water. And there are places in Texas where they're pretty close to that. I just talked this morning to a lady here whose her family owns some property west of Waco, and she said they like to sell the property, but they can't. There's no water. All the water levels. So it's a real issue in Texas. So anyway, let me get to the point here. Why should conservatives care about this? Because we care about freedom, opportunity, and prosperity. The state, the scale of the problem, Senator and Jeremy have talked about the scale. I call it a scale and a scope issue. The scale of the problem is immense. So we're behind times. We need to work on this now. The scope of the problem is the whole state. Now, each region has its own particular challenges that have to be dealt with. But this is something that calls for the state to be involved. It's just not going to happen realistically, it's not going to happen with just the private sector. There is a role for private sector, and they have had a role in the past. There's a role for local and county governments. But really, the state has the resources and the muscle really to tackle this problem. So that's what I'd say for conservatives.
I think it falls. I mean, it's. We're at Claremont McKenna. We had a saying like "Crescit cum commercio civitas," which in Latin is "with commerce comes the state." And so, we certainly the role of the state is to make sure that you have the infrastructure in place for commerce and prosperity that goes hand in hand, commerce to flourish. And so that's why there's certainly it's reasonable and acceptable that we have governmental involvement in road development, airport operation, as well as drinking water and wastewater operation, as well as Larry eloquently said. I mean, you need to have these fundamentals in place for economic growth, not to mention just mere survival. What I would add too is if you do have government involvement in water supply development, infrastructure development, you need to have performance measures in place to track what progress the government is making towards tackling our water infrastructure challenges. If we have a water supply deficit and we invest money, how are these new investments expanding our water supply portfolio? What's our return on investment? If we have this problem of aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems, how many failing or at-risk systems are we fixing with this dedication? I say this because we just need to know what is our ROI. What are we getting out of this? The thing that I do have some concern about, and I've been all over the state talking on newspapers and television about why water is important, why water infrastructure and investment is so important. I don't want this to be a bottomless pit of spending. I do want this to know what we're getting in return and what our success is in terms of tackling our infrastructure challenges.
I'd say a couple things. It's really interesting you mentioned third world. I've been involved in some nuclear conversations, and there's someone looking at SMRs in some areas, but they had an example, and it was regarding water and desal. We've all seen these individuals with these big 5-gallon buckets of water on their heads. They did a study to support the need for water and energy to pump water. 200 million hours a day in third world countries are spent from women, for the majority of the time, going out to get water at night and coming back with it in the day. And it's just, so that just tells you the quality of life issue. As far as, I think, and I want to say, this guy and TPF and people like that across the state have moved this conversation to a front that's never been. The momentum is huge. To your point, what role is government? And there's those, no government's good government. It's not true for infrastructure. I will tell you, I don't have a single member, House or Senate, and I've spoke to a bunch of them. I've traveled this state, part of this country, and globally the last 4 years. I've been out of my bed in Lubbock, Texas, more than I've been in it for 2 years. Just our marriage has never been better. So I don't know what that says about that, but no, I just say you commit to that. My grandmother said they were married 65 years. I asked her what the secret was. She said, well, he worked 40 of them at night. So, so she didn't even miss a beat. But I say all that to say, interesting enough, the group that normally is against government, I've met with a significant amount of those members, and every one of them, without exception, after an explanation of why and where we are and how we can fix this, they walk out of there advocating for it. So the time is right, the energy is right. We've done our job to get people like 2036 and people. We've done a good job of getting the need out there and educating people to believe it. Everybody from the statewide down, with some exceptions, we're working through this constitutional dedication. There's a conversation not to do that. It can't happen. We've got to get it over the line. But it's I tell people, and I don't mean this, our energy, we need to build capacity. We're working on it. I tell everything, there's air and there's water is life, and everything else is a quality of life. And that's where we're at.
Well, and Senator, of course, we appreciate your humility, because I know you've been working indefatigably for years and years and years to get to this point. And for folks in the room, I want to take a second to highlight just how momentous a moment this is. So Governor Abbott declares it an emergency item. Lieutenant Governor Patrick has elevated you with Senate Bill 7, with the water bill. In meetings we have with House members, Chairman Cody Harris and Senator Perry, I know you guys are singing from the same hymnal. It's almost like pinch me. Is this moment happening? And it's not, again, back to the miracle, it's not a miracle. It's been hard work and years of building this case. And so we'll talk about now, I think, the how. I think now is the right time to get specifically into the weeds. We're in pole position as a state, and the momentum is headed the right direction. What are the vehicles legislatively that you're looking at? Really, any of the bills you want to talk about that's going to address this problem? Would love for you to speak to those.
Well, there's a suite of about 5 bills that need tweaking statutes so that there's no barriers to development, right? Mm-hmm. The produced water liability conversation in the oil and gas industry, it's got lots of tentacles around it. It's an age-old issue. It's environmentally impactful that we get that right. And so that one's probably got 3 of those 5. There's the SJR, which is the constitutionally dedicated revenue stream that has to happen. And then, to somebody's point, I think, on the panel here, the state of Texas doesn't build pipes. And I want to be clear, this is more than just pipes. The Water Development Board does an awesome job of what's referred to as local sponsor projects. That would typically be a marine desal in Corpus. That's a Water Development Board right in their wheelhouse. They do a good job with that. They don't build pipes. We're kind of flying the plane as we're building it, right? So we had to come up with, what does an entity that will secure the fact that we're good stewards of the money and get to our accomplished goals. So we're in the process of developing that legislation. That will be Senate Bill 7. If you look at Senate Bill 7, it won't say there's $1 billion a year for a constitutional vote. That's not what it does, because there's not really a bill for constitutional dedication. So to clear the air is what you're looking at. So we're building the vehicle to make sure there's oversight over these conveyance, these pipelines, separate and apart from all the other things that are already embedded in the system. So that's been the challenge. Where we're at today, the $1 billion seems to be agreed to. I can say with confidence the majority, if not super majority. I think that everybody is on board with the dedication constitutionally, with the exception of we're working through some nuance with a couple of folks. They're not quite there yet, and I've just said I can't, in good faith, file a Senate Bill 7 without a constitutionally dedicated revenue, because the worst thing I can do is have all of you leave this session believing that we address water, when in reality, if it's not a constitutional dedicated revenue, we did not. By not doing that, we leave that money up to the discretion of the legislature every 2 years to fund. Doesn't always work. So that's where we're at. So you'll see 2 bills related to this if I'm successful. The SJR for the dedicated $1 billion a year. And I will say, in the base budget, we were hoping to get $5 billion to jumpstart this. We've got 2.5 in the Senate, and we've got 2.5 in the House. That's not a detriment. That's not a, oh my gosh, I lost the deal. We needed something significant, and 2.5 is. We hope to move that number up as the process goes. The challenges, I always try, my job is setting expectations. In politics, I figured it out. This is going to be a lot of money to show a commitment, and it will move the needle. But these projects are more than $1 billion a year. So which ones are ready that are in the most need? That's a priority, right? Which one can go to work today? But $1 billion, it's $25 million a mile on some of these conveyance lines. But we have some low-hanging fruit that I don't know about. So the expectation is going to, wow, we fixed water, but there's going to be this 20-year period in here where we're jumping on things that we can get done and develop water and have to sit back. So expectation, I think, is critical. The second piece of that, not to socialize water to the point that government controls it. As this water's moving through the pipes and delivery occurs, the consumer will pick up that tab so we get our money. And back to the cash flow, pretty quickly after water delivery we're 6 million acre feet gets us a significant amount of revenue back, and it really does turn the dime on these other pieces. So I can tell you, the people that's been involved in this conversation to get at this point, I think we've tried to check all the boxes. Is there going to be hurdles we didn't see? Absolutely. Is there going to be a lot of good stuff that we didn't expect? Absolutely. The most important thing is starting now to do it. The nice thing is we have undeveloped resources to do, and we have the wealth to do it. There's nothing between us and doing it other than a commitment.
And Senator, well, first off, thank you for pointing all that out. One of the items that's in this portfolio, I recall from interim hearings in the Water, Ag, and Rural Affairs Committee, is you talking about the difference between conservation and then new water sources. And of course, we had legislation on that last session. One of those avenues for new water that's addressing that shortfall that we're talking about is produced water. And we're in good company here. I've met a lot of folks from Midland, Odessa, good oil Texans, and I wonder if you could take a second and then I can open it up to everyone here just to talk about what is produced water, what are you guys looking at on it this session?
25 million barrels of water a day out of the Permian. That's the Delaware and every Midland, those basins. 25 million barrels of water a day, 42 gallons per barrel. Nastiest of the nastiest water you got to clean up. It's 125,000 parts and up, and it's got stuff in it that obviously are not helpful and are harmful. 6 years into pilot projects, I've got 6 pilot projects from legislation I passed, 19 or somewhere back there. And 3 of those are private sector related. 3 of those are people that signed up for what's called the Texas Produced Water Consortium, and they've been working through it. Kind of an update where they're at. We have got our 3rd growing season of agriculture to see if that produced water can be beneficial use. We're checking the biomass accumulation, so is there any nasty stuff from the produced water accumulating in our soil? To date, no new constituents, there's been no surprises, and there's been no problems. And actually, we've had to switch crops because there was too much water. So it's showing real promise, really short order, to actually deliver beneficial use to an agriculture sector, and it will open up a whole new market. The second leg of that is potable use, and I've said it 1,000 times, nobody wants to drink dirty water. We are in the accreditation process with the labs that are certifying that. There will be legislation that will move the needle to where, when and if, and I know for a fact today I can drink produced water. I know for the fact it's possible, but when and if, we're not going to have to come back to the legislature and wait 2 to 4 years to implement rules to use that water. So we'll leave this legislation with produced water at the gate, with all of the science in the next 3 to 5 years probably verifying fact that it's a real source. It's a twofer. The oil and gas industry must find a way to deal with produced water other than injection. Injection is what's causing the seismicity issues. And the fact that I know for a fact we can do it, and more every day, people that are in this world doing some things, they're finding the commercially viable economic byproduct of the discharge. Lithium, someone had told us they had developed a process to do 500,000 ton of lithium out of 50,000 barrels. That's a 600 million metric ton market in the U.S., and it's $30,000. So you're beginning to see, if people are going, if there's enough seed stock, we can justify the investment to develop it. And that's just one aspect of produced water that is going to have a whole different commercial path out. So I like where we're at. It's something we need to do. It's 500,000 acre feet once all the technologies are signed off in the Permian Basin area.
Yeah, that's incredible. So I want to come back to you, Jeremy, for a moment. You spoke earlier about the relationship between energy and water, and oftentimes when I've seen you testify, you combine them both in the same breath, right? Because it's important to have that perspective in public policy. I want to give you a chance to talk about any of the other items you're working on as it relates to that relationship between energy and water and why both are needed to get either or.
And I think this comes back to when I talked earlier about how there's two big reasons why we need to look at water. One, to solve our water supply deficit, and two, to fix the problem of aging, deteriorating systems. If we don't have enough water, then some of the data that we have at Texas 2036, based on some reports we've generated, suggests that the reliability of our electric grid could really come into question. Keep in mind that about 55% of the state's generation fleet is thermal. It's natural gas, coal, nuclear. Each of these generation sources typically uses water in order to work, okay? So about 55% of our generation needs water to generate. Now, in August 2022, there was a notice that came out of ERCOT. It was kind of small, hard to notice, but we saw it. And in August of 2022, ERCOT was saying, if drought conditions persist for another 18 months, then about 25% of the state's thermal generating capacity is at risk of intermittent service delivery. And so basically what they were saying is, like, if drought continued for another 18 months, and we know from historic records that Texas has had droughts that have gone on for years, then the reliability of our electric grid would have been endangered if we didn't have enough water. Also keep in mind that in 2011, Texas endured its worst one-year drought of record ever in recorded history. If you lived here in 2011, it was 1,000 degrees, that's a fact, every day. It never rained. It was miserable. And if you're living in North Texas around Wichita Falls, I mean, they were becoming like ground zero for a crisis and disaster. But something else happened up in North Texas you may not have heard about, is that there was this natural gas generating plant that was up there. I think it was called Turkey Peak. That had to go offline for about 18 months because the reservoir serving that generation plant didn't have enough water. That wasn't a big headline, but it happened. And I say this, the ERCOT notice and what happened in North Texas in 2011 to underscore the relationship that our state's energy grid has for delivering reliable, consistent electricity to homes and businesses with our water resources. That's what makes it so important. Now, folks have come to me and said, oh, I know what the answer is. You just build more wind and solar and battery storage. No, because you need to have this thermal generation in order to make sure you have dispatchable generation 24/7, 365.
Yeah. Well, I think
I'll just add on
yeah.
just a little bit. Another item just that gets me concerned is just hearing about all these reports about the data centers that are going to plan for the region, because they're big energy users and therefore water users as well. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I might just add on the produced water. I'm very excited about the developments in produced water. And it's amazing how little time really has gone. I mean, it's been a super accelerated research effort to look into produced water. I happen to sit on the advisory committee for the Texas Seismological Network. And so produced water and the induced seismicity issue is a huge concern for the oil and gas industry. In fact, it's limited them many times as the Railroad Commission has basically kind of restricted the industry's ability to dispose of produced water. So all this progress is really encouraging, and there's just been a tremendous amount of energy devoted to that. I'm excited to see what's going to happen.
Wonderful. Well, that's the cue. So we'll now open up to audience question. And before we call on folks,
Y'all are not shy.
Emphasis on concision. The shorter the question, the longer the response you're going to get. So let's please keep these questions tight. We'll start right here with the gentleman, second row.
Drill down on produced water. What are you able to do with the water with respect to the recent research in terms of growing fiber like trees and possibly cotton? And is it a dream of all of us that we can eventually use it for food crops, or are you making progress there?
So hopefully the question is, what is the agricultural beneficial use look like under the produced water studies currently? Well, I'll say that we started with some variety, I think it was cotton, figured out they could just put too much water on it, move it to alfalfa hay that could take a lot more cotton, and last check it was doing great. Absolutely. I mean, you have to be able to put it into the food supply, or you're just growing food and fiber. I mean, fiber pieces, it's important. But what I also see in this is a hydroponics industry that doesn't exist in the desert. That you take the environmentals out, but you've got the water sources now.
Using hyacinths.
Yeah. So I'm just saying. I think, and let me back up. I live in West Texas, Lubbock, Texas. We have lots and lots of flat land, and we have a group of people out there that welcome any kind of innovation or ingenuity, and we have cheap real estate. And just Abilene, Texas, the Stargate or the Lansing conversation, Childress, Texas is looking at, we're in line for some Space Act conversation. Why did I say that? I know that Lubbock, Texas, it's about 400,000 regional county now with different cities in it, is asked for every year a company says, we would love to come to you. Can you guarantee water? And the answer is not that much. And so this will be an economic revival for a lot of people that are tired of the rat race or don't want to pay $300 a foot or have a community that may not be supportive. So it's a whole different venue. On the beneficial use side, my ultimate goal, and when I say this, I get all this pushback, right? If you don't start with the ultimate goal of a potable standard, you will not do the things along the way to get there. So I purposely, intentionally, and I expect, knowing I can today, I will drink a glass of water from a produced well that has done all the tests that shows that it's safe. Today, I can do that. And there are industries that tell me I can do it all day long. How much and how scalable is the conversation? So I know we're going to get there. Beneficial use for agricultural purposes will be the first level, and we're, I think, really short order to having that proven that when you can justify the investment and it's scalable to do it.
Keep on this side right here, this right here.
Wastewater goes into the equation. What are you doing? Wastewater goes into the equation. What are you doing in terms of allowing that to be a viable use of water, potable water?
So you speak to reuse.
Yep.
Reuse is a vital component. It has a lot of permitting and discharge things working through TCQ. So long term, I think that's a very deserving part of funding. I have to get the input, I believe, first, and those that have reuse plans already are collecting fees to do that. In a lot of these cities, it's part of their plan that they've been collecting fees in advance, but long-term reuse will be a component of eligibility. Today. It's not, because if I opened up the conversation for reuse and funded that, I would have every municipal taking their effluent, as they should be, and reusing it, but reuse can only go so far from a supply perspective.
What I do like about reuse is that you can really expand the value of those water molecules. I mean, they do water reuse on the space station, and we know we can do that. And so I think when you look at the water plan and what some regions are doing, especially in the more arid areas, they're looking at reuse as in direct potable reuse, where you just cycle that molecule through the city over and over again. It's fine, it's safe. Don't call it toilet to tap. Yeah, but it can be used. And yeah, I think the chairman also brings an issue like, there's the other issue with reuse is like when you treat it and you discharge it after it's been cleaned and put it back in the river. That's where it opens up this can of worms with regard to who has a right to that. And in 2007, when I was working for Chairman Caligari, we tried to untangle that can of worms, and it's way easier said than done.
Real quick, I started this conversation in the supply area. My predecessor started in the regulatory area, and it died there. So I deliberately went to, let me develop the supply plan, and then let's have a conversation what regulation needs to look like. They always got stopped on the front end when you started there.
Great point, great point. Let's go to this gal in the green jacket.
So water is a big issue also for international relations. What's the role water is going to play in this new U.S.-Mexico relation?
Well, having been intensely involved in those meetings over the 1944 treaty, when Mexico comes to Texas, or we went to Texas to have our treaty 5-year plan reconciled, and I'll just be blunt, politically they cannot honor their treaty. It's dependent solely on rainfall. politically, if they tried to honor it, they had people getting shot. So after that first meeting and understanding of their political dynamic, our side, where they have access to the water before we do, just as a physical logistics, I knew we were not getting relief. Texas has no role in that conversation, unfortunately. Now, fast forward, we have a really effective new commissioner on the federal side that was able to negotiate a minute that really kind of does begin the conversation. You shall give us some water, but there's no teeth and no enforcement in it. So I tell everybody, if we could have full allotment appropriated of the 1944 treaty, we still are water deficit in the valley to begin with. Secondary to that is, do not consider that a predictable source, because until, and I think this administration, and I haven't had the conversation with the right level, until they threaten the tariff or whatever trade deficit they want to create over the water issue, we have no control over the water issue.
I'll just add one thing, and it's not on the treaty so much, but there has been some cooperation between Mexican and Texas authorities on the groundwater issue, and there may be some opportunities to work out sharing agreements there. As you know, groundwater doesn't care about political boundaries. It can flow either direction. And so we're looking, or the Water Development Board and others like the Texas Water Resources Institute has looked very closely at cooperating with Mexican authorities on understanding the groundwater flow between the countries.
Right.
Thanks. About 3 years ago, we had a horrible drought with the Aguadilla Aquifer in West Texas. You know, led to a lot of farmers, particularly cotton farmers, losing their crop. You know, as we address this in the long term, what can we do in the short term to help farmers have better conservation practices, or install local infrastructure that might just make it easier for them to pass through these challenging times? As I understand it, this is something that we need to address long term. So what can we do in the short term?
Living in that area and having farmers as clients in my practice for 40 plus years, they're the best stewards of the water. They have the most reason to preserve it and the most economic reason to use it wisely. There was a federal loan program or federal grant program called Equipped. It's been around since the 50s probably, but the last good round of funding was like in the 80s or 90s. But so there was equipment to allow farmers to be better stewards by conservation, specifically digital reading of temperature in the plants, knowing when it needs water, knowing what time of day to rewater. So a lot of that stuff has been implemented. Drip from the Israelis have kind of taught hold in these areas, so we got a lot of drip where we used to have center pivot. But here's the conversation. I don't know how much more farmers get from conservation efforts that are already in place, because the technologies are pretty much there. What you can do to actually add value to them is limited. And then when and I'm going to use this as an example, it's not exact, but when it costs you $2 a bag or $2 a pound for cotton, and you're getting $1 on the market, there's no money to pursue that. What we're finding is generational farming is going away. The kids of the farmers don't want to do it. It's hard, it's unpredictable, and it's very risky. You talk about going to Vegas, a farmer does it every fall. So there's just not a whole lot of opportunity to expand the existing technologies for conservation that has not already been implemented.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your leadership on the water issue. I'm a frac engineer, and I work all across the state, and I get firsthand to see the implementation of produced water, especially starting fracking in the 2010s to right now. What I would say is the industry leadership and getting industry at the table in the leadership. With the water restrictions, we were forced to be more efficient, and we have been doing that with the use of produced water. We just tapped into some of that you're doing in West Texas. I would say the true conservation needs to be at the municipal level. And what oversight can the Senate bring for places like the urban areas where we see water running down the street, busted lines and all of those things, and then they tell us not to wash our clothes or water our lawn? We still pay that price. So what kind of bite can the legislature have on Harris County, Bexar County, those areas where they see water running down the street, and you want us
We
to
need a
pay
carrot and stick approach. We need to be an Arizona model. we need to incentivize development with a water conscious initiative. I think the state could incentivize AstroTurf instead of grass, right? A small subsidy. So at some point, but here's the best governor of local water use: raise the rates. When you raise the rates, they stop wasting it. At the same time, I think rather than telling a Texas homeowner that they can't grow this, you're not going to be successful. But when you can implement a development strategy that starts producing this, it's kind of like the shiny penny on the block, right? When someone gets that and it looks good, they're going to start having those conversations. So we're not there yet. We've got money. Senate Bill 28 put a little bit of an incentive money into having those conversations. We've already got development with low flush toilets, low water toilets, shower heads that are low. So we've been there for decades. We need to do more of that. But I think rather a state mandate on a local government, you shall, which goes nowhere, we've got to come back and figure out what is it the consumer will rainwater harvesting. We had a situation yesterday, somebody in one of these event centers, the roof is massive enough that if you have a big enough receptacle, you can literally catch enough rainwater to fund the whole water needs for that event center. So those are good ideas.
And I'd say that the legislature's done a good job of setting up some good carrots for cities that have leaky water issues. I mean, providing financial incentives, asking that the cities look closer at that data with regard to water loss. And so I think this is it's a kinder, gentler way of trying to incentivize municipalities to move towards this policy. I agree with what the chairman says. I mean, that you can fine a city, but that fine is just going to be passed on to taxpayers. You can prohibit them from doing something, but again, I mean, there's all these sticks that the legislature can use. I don't think you necessarily get the best desired outcome at the other end of the day.
Right. For the gentleman in the back of the room.
Thank you. Quick question, it's a big topic, is I'd like to hear your thoughts on property rights, water rights. It's a big subject, so thank you.
No, it is. It's one that I chose not to go on the front end with because I knew it'd come up, and it has come up. So two things. One, a lot of this is surface water, 2 million acre feet possibly, and it's not permitted water, so we kind of avoid some of those conversations on the front end. On the groundwater supply, so we've got fresh water and then we have brackish water. We're talking about going and getting the next level of water. Texas is clear. Brag and Day, that's my water. Now, what I had a conversation with a farmer in Lubbock is every time I hear these initiatives, it means the state's coming to get my water. And I said, well, I guess technically that may be correct, but here's the question I have for you. If we're going to develop something that you would have never developed as a landowner, you could not afford it, you would not do it, you could never get there. And the state steps in and does that. And because this supply that's coming across supplants what you're using in the aquifer so that the cities can use the new supply, is that an in-kind water contribution to allow you to pump longer more? And his answer was yes, that is. Because if the cities are using 300,000 acre feet a year and they now have an alternative for that 300,000 acre feet, that they're not pulling it out of the ground that you were depending on to water your crops, we've just extended the life of that aquifer. And when I explained it that way, he's like, yeah, I get that.
Go right here, 5 rows back.
I see him shaking his head. Let me address it this way. If there's a check cut, it just adds to the cost of water, and so be it. I mean, I'm not opposed to paying a landowner, but as I told that particular farmer, don't quit your day job. It ain't going to be that big.
Coming from the city of Houston, could you go into the details of what's being planned for the Houston area in terms of your plans for water there?
Well, I think Houston is a very interesting thing happening there. Is for decades, all of that development was supported by the Gulf Coast aquifer. And what happened is it's a clay aquifer, and the more they pumped out of it, it started confining. And so what I like to tell people, if you ever go to the San Jacinto battlefield, you're not actually standing where the battle was fought. That was actually 15 feet above your head because of the subsidence there. And so there's been this huge effort to convert the use of reliance on groundwater and surface water So there's been some like huge projects developed there. There's an interbasin transfer project. There's, I think, one of the largest drinking water treatment projects in the world is being developed by the city of Houston, as well as these regional water authorities that are working to purchase surface water to deliver to MUDs in central and western and northern Harris County. And so there's a very ambitious effort that's ongoing to convert the water supply in Houston. But there's still this bigger issue with regard to aging, deteriorating systems in the city proper. And I know that Mayor Whitmire and Greater Houston Partnership are trying to do what they can do to get the financial resources for the city to fix that problem.
I'll just add on in Harris County, because you have a subsidence district there, Harris-Galveston subsidence district. So that's been effective in getting sort of the central Houston area off of groundwater, more on surface water. Some of the issues now are in the outlying suburban areas, high growth areas like Montgomery County, maybe Fort Bend County. And that's where groundwater is the most economical. It's a pretty cheap local water supply, but it has that consequence of land subsidence, which then affects the flooding issues. So, but what it hurts the homeowners or the consumers in that area when they're faced with paying much larger water bills to these necessary conversions. So it becomes quite a tangle of issues there. But there's been overall a movement towards surface water conversion in Houston, but still challenges are there.
Time for one last quick question. We'll go Mr. Bennett in back here.
Thank you all for being here on this important topic that we're all so dialed into. This is more of a Midwest issue, but it affects the whole country as well. Visiting with people in the energy business especially, I recognize that one of the greatest man-made environmental threats that we face here in the U.S. is the destruction of our wetlands due to corn ethanol subsidies, which were put in place back in the 70s when we thought we were going to run out of oil and gas. And because of those subsidies, we're plowing up the wetlands, which are the lungs for the river system, and consequently sending fertilizer down into the Gulf, which causes a red tide, and it's a horrific thing. My son Brent is a director of energy policy at TPPF. I'm on the board. He did just a quick study for me last week that showed that it takes about 4 trillion gallons of water to produce the corn that we use for ethanol. And we figured if 3 trillion of that, 75% comes from rainwater, there's still a trillion barrels of water. I said barrels of water, trillion barrels of water that come from irrigation. And hopefully with Agricultural Secretary Rollins, we can work on this. I know it's always been a struggle for TPPF because we want to support the farmers. I think we still can, but I think instead of paying them to grow corn ethanol, if we just had like a CRP program where we paid them to let those cornfields go fallow and go back to the wetlands, it'd be beneficial. So I just wanted to see if any of you had thought on that or if you had any comments about that. Brent's going to be publishing a paper on it soon. So.
Well, I really look forward to reading that. My family's from southeastern Iowa, and so there's a fun T-shirt that says "What goes on in the cornfield stays in the cornfield." So yeah, that's Midwestern humor for you. But one thing you're talking about there is this thing called nature-based solutions, where wetlands are natural filtration, where gravity and hydraulics and root systems work to clean and purify water, and also helps create habitat for game animals. There's tremendous cost efficiency and natural efficiency through these types of solutions. And so they're also being used in Dallas by the Trinity River Authority. They have a huge wetland project that filters the water, and it lowers their cleaning costs while creating a habitat for ducks. And so I know this may sound somewhat crunchy, but there's a lot of common sense here about using nature as God designed it to allow for better stewardship of our water resources, and also with regard to our flood resources as well. I mean, there is development that has happened in some areas where the rivers just jump that banks during a storm. And so, but if you let those areas work, as natural floodplains, that type of solution, again, is more cost effective in the long run.
Great. Well, that is time. So please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists for a great discussion.